Imagine a prison you cannot see, but you can feel pressing against your internal organs with every step you take. This was not a dungeon of stone and iron, but a cage made of silk, whalebone, and social expectations. In the 19th century, the bustling streets of London were a marvel of the modern world, yet for half the population, they were a landscape of physical torture. We call this the urinary leash. It sounds clinical, but the reality was a nightmare of biology versus architecture. Women were effectively under house arrest, not by law, but by the simple, agonizing fact that if they left their homes for more than a few hours, they had absolutely nowhere to go when nature called. The city was built for men. Men could relieve themselves in the gutters, against walls, or in the newly built public urinals that dotted the street corners. But for a woman, to be seen entering a water closet was to admit she had bodily functions, which was considered vulgar, disgusting, and dangerously lower class. A lady did not sweat, she did not eat in public, and she certainly did not urinate. This biological denial forced women to dehydrate themselves purposefully before leaving the house, drinking nothing for hours, leading to chronic infections and fainting spells that doctors lazily diagnosed as female hysteria. But the true horror wasn't just the lack of a room, it was the trap they wore on their bodies. Fashion in this era was a weapon. A woman carried between 10 to 30 pounds of fabric on her hips. Underneath the silk, she was encased in a steel or bone corset that crushed her ribs and pressed violently against her bladder. Even if she found a dark corner, how does one maneuver a cage of crinoline and layers of petticoats without exposing herself to the world? The answer to this logistical nightmare lies in the most scandalous secret of Victorian fashion. They weren't wearing underwear, at least not the kind you are thinking of. If you were to lift the heavy, mud-stained hem of a Victorian lady's skirt, you would not find a closed pair of panties. You would find split-crotch drawers. These were two separate legs of fabric joined at the waist, but left completely open in the middle. To modern eyes, this looks erotic or bizarre, but in the 19th century, it was a survival mechanism born of pure desperation. With a corset lacing your waist to 18 inches, bending at the waist or squatting was physically impossible. You could not pull your underwear down because you could not reach them under the mountain of skirts. The split crotch allowed a woman to simply spread her legs and let gravity do the work. It was a design born of necessity, allowing her to relieve herself without disrobing. But this convenience came with a terrifying risk. If she tripped, if the wind blew too hard, or if she sat carelessly, she was completely exposed. This garment turned every bodily function into a high-stakes tactical operation. But what happened when there was no chamber pot? What happened when a woman was caught in the middle of a crowded park or a busy street with no privacy in sight? She had to learn a technique that stripped away every ounce of her supposed dignity. They called it the leg raise, a polite term for a humiliating act. In the absence of toilets, women had to learn to urinate standing up, right there in the public street. They would find a gutter or a patch of grass, look around to ensure no one was watching too closely, and subtly lift one leg to open the split in their drawers. They would release their bladder while standing fully upright, maintaining a stoic expression on their face as if nothing were happening, while a stream of urine pooled at their boots. It required the balance of a dancer and the nerves of a thief. One wrong move meant splashing the expensive fabric of her petticoats. One witness meant social ruin. It was a secret performance art of shame practiced by millions of women. The cobblestones of London were awash with human waste, and women had to contribute to the filth while pretending to float above it. The cognitive dissonance was maddening. Society demanded they be angels of purity, yet forced them to act like stray animals in alleyways. But sometimes the leg raise wasn't an option. Sometimes the environment was too crowded, or the urge was too sudden. For those moments, the industry invented devices that seemed like instruments of torture disguised as convenience. Enter the pea pocket. This wasn't a modern plastic gadget. It was a crude, absorbent pouch sewn directly into the lining of a dress or worn on a belt under the skirt. Imagine walking around with a bag of sponges or linen scraps strapped to your thigh, designed to catch and hold urine as you walked. It was a wearable diaper, a humid, heavy sack of waste that a woman had to carry with her until she returned home. The hygiene implications were horrific. Bacterial infections were rampant. The constant contact with damp, soiled fabric caused rashes and sores that women suffered in silence. There were no antibiotics, no steroid creams, just the burning itch of ammonia against raw skin. Yet, they wore them. They wore them because the alternative was wetting themselves in the middle of a ballroom or a church service. And then there was the bordaloo, a gravy boat-shaped porcelain pot that women were expected to carry in their muffs or handbags. In a carriage or a quiet corner, a woman would struggle to slide this cold ceramic device under her layers of skirts, pressing it against her body while praying the carriage didn't hit a bump. It was a precarious game of roulette, played with bodily fluids. But no matter how skilled a woman was with a bordaloo or how absorbent her pee pocket was, there was one enemy she could not defeat: the smell. The Victorian city stank of coal, manure, and rot, but the scent of stale urine on a person was a marker of the lower class. A lady had to be odorless. This created a paradox where women were dousing themselves in heavy perfumes not for vanity, but for camouflage. Lavender, musk, and rosewater were weapons in the war against biology. Women carried scented handkerchiefs, pressing them to their noses, not just to block the city's stench, but to mask their own. If a drop had landed on her petticoat during a standing relief in an alley, that petticoat would smell for the rest of the day. The heavy wool and velvet fabrics couldn't be washed easily. They were brushed and aired out. The accumulation of odors in a Victorian wardrobe is something history books politely ignore. This fear of smelling unclean kept many women prisoners in their own homes. The urinary leash wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Why go to the theater if you have to spend the entire second act in agony, terrified that you might smell like a latrine? The disparity between the sexes was stark and cruel. A man in Victorian London could walk from one end of the city to the other, stopping at public houses, clubs, or street urinals whenever he pleased. The city was his playground. For a woman, the city was a desert. The first public women's lavatory in London didn't open until the mid-19th century, and even then, it was a scandal. Men protested, claiming that building toilets for women would encourage them to leave their homes and neglect their families. Think about that logic. The patriarchy was so terrified of female independence that they weaponized the bladder. They preferred women to be in pain rather than be present. When facilities finally did open, they were often unsafe, poorly lit, or charged a fee, the famous spend a penny, which priced out the poorest women who needed them the most. So, the streets remained dangerous. Women who sought seclusion in dark alleys to relieve themselves were prime targets for assault. The simple biological need to pee put a woman's life at risk every time she stepped out the door. This history recontextualizes everything we know about the era. We look at paintings of women in parks, their faces serene, and we miss the reality. That woman isn't just sitting still because she is poised. She is sitting still because moving hurts. She isn't refusing tea because she is not thirsty. She is refusing it because she is terrified of where it will go. The urinary leash was one of the most effective tools of oppression in history because it was invisible. It didn't require laws or guards. It just required a lack of plumbing. It turned a woman's own body into her jailer. It forced her to plan every movement, every sip of water, every route on a map. It stripped her of spontaneity and freedom. We often talk about the suffrage movement and the fight for the vote, but we forget the fight for the toilet. You cannot vote if you cannot leave the house. You cannot march in the streets if you are in agony. The liberation of women is inextricably tied to the liberation of their bodily functions. So, the next time you walk into a public restroom, however dirty or inconvenient it might be, remember the split-crotch drawers. Remember the heavy, urine-soaked sponges strapped to the thighs of elegant ladies. Remember the leg raise in the dark alleyway. History is not just battles and treaties. It is the quiet, humiliating struggle of millions of people trying to maintain their dignity in a world designed to strip it away. The Victorian era wasn't a time of romance. For women, it was a time of holding it in until it hurt. If you are grateful for modern plumbing, hit that like button. And if you want to uncover more dark, dirty secrets that history class was too polite to teach you, subscribe now. The truth is always messier than you think.